Is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I am Christiana Ellis,
I'm Mike McTee.
and we are making our way through the American Film Institute's top 100 movies list. We have spent a long time doing this podcast, but we have made our way all the way to number 18, The General, and number 17, The Graduate. We will be talking about both tonight. But first up, number 18, The General, 1927. I don't have the list up. Yes, 1927 silent film starring Buster Keaton, the only Buster Keaton film on the list, and notable for the first time in quite a while on this list, a movie that in advance of this viewing, neither of us had seen. But now we have. So let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it.
What did you think of The General?
So I'm glad I watched it.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that you always hear about, but one that, again, the reason we neither of us had seen it is it's not one that you're really going to seek out. So this was a good framework for which to make sure that I did see this movie because of its legacy, and it is good. I I just don't know that I'm going to leave it this high on the list. And it's not because of any failings of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it. I mean, it's a silent movie. It's well done, but it just doesn't. It didn't have the impact that some of the other movies that are just below it had on me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's almost like it's on here because it was so well put together for the time period.
Yes.
It's the production value is incredibly high. The story is really tight. The action and just things that they other movies couldn't really do at that point. This movie did,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I think it rose above. I was reading that initially because it's billed as a comedy, and I mean it is. There are funny parts to it. It's almost like an action comedy.
Yeah.
The action is almost as interesting. And so I think that it got it was mediocre reviews, mediocre box office at the time it was released. But I think it's partly because that people didn't really recognize that they were seeing something that they had never seen before that was probably changing the way that not it by itself, but movies that were starting to do things like this changed the way that movies could be put together. It's a very easy example to point to in this sort of transition from basically just filmed theater
Right.
to actually having on location and sets and you know action and comedy all mixed together and a unique story that could only be told in the film medium. Again, it's not the only example of that, but it's a very easy one to point to because of the trains and because of that stuff. So I respect it. I'm glad I saw it. I enjoyed myself, but it ultimately didn't blow me away and say this is one of the top 20 movies ever made.
Yeah. I agree pretty much entirely with what you just said. I like Buster Keaton, but this is not one of his funnier movies, honestly.
Mm-mm. Yeah,
I
it's
I
not because of the comedy part. Yeah.
Well, it certainly has plenty of funny parts in it, but if we're talking about let's rank Buster Keaton movies in terms of funniness, it's not really very high. But he made a ton of shorts, and even some that are longer features. But what's remarkable about this one is the way it's made, and just kind of, frankly, the audaciousness of the way it's made, and just the using real trains, dropping a real train into a river, firing an actual cannonball, all of these things that we think of. The problem almost is that we are so accustomed to the easier ways we have to do all those things now that you have to actually take a moment to think back and recognize, oh, but he did it for real. And when we talk about for real, like with the cannon, like we see him riding this cannonball on the poster here, like it wasn't even like for real, as in the practical effects and not digital effects. It was sorry, it was literally firing a real cannonball with real gunpowder with him right there and them just having to make sure that they measured the amount of gunpowder precisely enough and knew how the cannon would work precisely enough so that he didn't blow himself up. Because that very well could have happened. So for it to look as dangerous as it did, yeah. So let me take just a moment to put the dog in the other room, but I'll be right back.
Okay. So while that's happening, I think Chris brought up a good point about how he did a lot of shorts, and I think that's the comedy within this movie is actually done in the frame of shorts. Like the movie itself is not like a whole long comedy, but there are funny little scenes in it. For example, when he goes to enlist and they turn him down, don't tell him why, even though it's because he's too valuable. But then him trying to figure out why he wasn't able to join the army is basically like a little short film within the film that's really funny. Of him kind of sizing up everybody and trying to decide, well, what does this person have that I don't have? And then someone else comes, finishes enlisting, and they are completely different. And so he's trying to do this weird calculus in his head of like why he couldn't join the army. It's funny, but it's self-contained within the movie.
So I didn't hear what you were saying.
I know I was talking to the audience.
Okay, sure.
I was just basically talking about, if we have any, the idea that within the movie you can see like his like how he did a lot of short films, because some of the comedy is very, very contained within the movie. Like they're almost like scenes within the movie that are shorts. Like when they turn him down from enlisting into the army, and he's trying to figure out why, and he's sizing up everybody else who gets to enlist, and trying to figure out like where his shortcoming is. Like that's not part of the bigger narrative of the movie. It's almost like its own little short film within the film.
Yeah, it's really just establishing the premise that he's not a coward. He tried, but doesn't get to be in the army and gets rejected for that reason. But it's like that's what we're establishing there.
Right, and the whole thing makes no sense. Like they wouldn't reject him for the reason he's more valuable as an engineer, and not just tell him that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then not only that, but also the idea that they don't tell him that, and also somehow like the girl's father and brother are saying, and yeah, we saw him. We didn't even see him go in. It's like, but what? Like it's 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 not a big deal, but it's definitely a case of you feel like we sometimes talk about modern rom-coms where the idiot plot of if these people just had a conversation, it would have resolved all of this.
Yeah.
But that said, we want to establish him as someone who, through no fault of his own, has actually tried to do what his girl wanted from him, but due to a misunderstanding, he's rejected. And so for him to sort of, win her back later, win her approval later is, it's part of what we're rooting for.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is interesting to note about this, though, is first of all, it's telling a version of a real historical train chase, right? Like this is basically a fictionalized version of something that really happened during the Civil War. But it's also interesting looking at it today because our good guys are the Confederates, which is doesn't tend to be the perspective we would take in a more modern telling, but was actually more the norm at the time. I mean, you think of oh, uh, Gone with the Wind, right? You think about some of the other movies made at the time. Um, I don't have all of the historical context there, but my understanding is that there was a lot more. Maybe there was context of the South having trouble due to all Reconstruction, and they're just the cultural. There's a lot more sympathy for the South at that time. Maybe partly also because we were still in a time pre-civil rights era where people weren't likely to be as sympathetic to, like, yeah, but they were slave because but slavery, right?
Right.
So if people are not sympathetic to that point of view, yeah, I guess it's probably easier to take the Confederate side. But so just watching it through that modern view, like, I mean, none of that is in this movie, but it's just from this modern lens looking back and saying, okay, our hero is someone who's wanting to, to fight for the Confederates. The general that saves the day at the end is supposed to be Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is going on to become one of the founders of the KKK. So that feels weird in just historical context. I mean, but all of that has to come from outside of the movie because none of that is in the film,
Right.
right? But I think that I so just to go back to what you were saying before and what I started to answer is that I think this movie is almost a little bit like a magic trick in the sense that you can a lot of magic tricks that people do, like close-up magic and everything. The actual secret of the trick is really not that complicated. It's just so difficult that it requires so much practice that an ordinary person would just never spend that much time doing it. Right? That's
Right.
what a lot of tricks come down to. Is it's just very hard to do. It's not complicated. There's not some mystical secret. It's just a very specific movement with a very specific timing in a way that requires lots of practice. And once you get to the point where a lot of the tricks this movie is doing are much easier to do in other ways, they stop seeming so impressive, even though they would have been just as hard at the time.
Yeah.
So, like, some of the more dramatic ones, like, first of all, like, there's running across tops of the train all constantly while it's moving. But, like, the whole bit where the cannon has, like, pointed to where it's, like, going to blow the top of the engine off, maybe. And then to try to get out of its way, he goes down onto the cowcatcher, and then he ends up holding one of these gigantic railroad ties, and then the train in front has dropped another one, and he has to throw the one with perfect timing to knock the other one off the track
Yeah.
while the train is moving, and he is right there in prime position to get crushed if anything goes wrong. It's the thing is, what's kind of amazing about it is that we would never ever do that like that again because it's stupid dangerous and there are easier ways.
Right.
But at the same time, that's part of what makes it interesting is knowing there wasn't an easier way. He had to actually do it. Now, that's not to say they, weren't taking precautions. Like he knew what he was doing in the sense that, train was probably not going quite as fast as it looked like it was. Things like the trivia says that he was literally counting grains of gunpowder with tweezers to make sure that the cannon was going to fire just exactly right. But, just all of these really clever little sequences, like with the cannon, where he can't figure out how to make the cannon not point straight towards the engine. And so he's just like, how's this going to work? What's going to happen? And it turns out that it doesn't fire until just this perfect moment where the track is going and the engine has curved away. And so now the cannon on a subsequent car fires off and hits the other train he's chasing. And it's just like, there's so many really clever little cool train gimmicks that they put together in this. Um,
Yeah,
but
that's the most fun part of the movie is the essentially the chase.
mhm.
You know, I mean, the rest of the movie's fine. I mean, like I said, it's entertaining. It has funny parts, but the the train chase itself is what is pretty cool. Yeah,
Right. So I think, certainly what's what's a little frustrating for me trying to talk about this movie is that, for one, Buster Keaton was certainly a prominent enough figure that it feels like there ought to be a Buster Keaton movie on the list, right? But should it be this one? But if it's not this one, which one? And that's where you get into the problem where he honestly just made so many more short films, and that's what he was more known for. That trying to choose a feature, like Charlie Chaplin made a whole bunch of short movies too, but he also made some really spectacular feature films that are better fits for the list. Buster Keaton didn't make as many of those. And then this one was a departure at the time, crazy expensive at the time because of how audacious it is in its its reach and how much it's trying to accomplish and how successfully it pulls it off. But it was crazy expensive, not as funny. And I think the problem was, despite all of these things being true, a lot of audiences don't necessarily see that on the screen, right? What
right.
they see is, oh, this is interesting, but I don't have an understanding of how difficult it would be to do that. So I guess it's fine, but it's not as funny, and so I end the movie not being as impressed as I probably should be by how difficult some of those stunts were. And that's where maybe that's the problem ultimately, is that some of the things he does, he actually makes look easier than they really were, in a way that unfortunately makes it less impressive on screen.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's and that's like you said, it's hard to figure out what to do with this movie because you don't want to punish him for that
Mm-hmm.
because that was kind of the point. Is that, like you said, the magic trick of like working so hard to make something look so easy that was really so difficult.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like I also still have to, you
Yeah.
know, like it's my list when it comes down to it.
Oh,
It's your list,
absolutely. Yeah.
so it's yeah. I don't need to leave it up high just because.
It's
But I feel some of the same reasons like that it wasn't a financial success. Like I feel some of that same stuff. It's like yeah, I mean it was cool. Like it was fun to watch, but it wasn't like I said, it just didn't have that impact on me. And it's I was trying to again just kind of reconcile in my head, and I was thinking about there's going to be some other movies that come up on here who are on here for doing things for the first time or changing the way the film were made. Like Citizen Kane has a ton of that stuff,
mm-hmm.
but Citizen Kane also has just a powerful story
Yeah.
that like resonates above and beyond just the technical feats, and so it sort of combines all of those things. And I think, and then we're going to get to The Graduate here too, and it does some of that too,
Mm-hmm.
where it's using film techniques that weren't common or were common for different things and applying them in different settings, and but it does it to tell a really really effective powerful story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this just told a kind of a fun train chase, and ultimately, and again, it's hard because you don't want to, like I said, you don't want to punish him for it because he did a
Right.
great job, but
Well, yeah.
ultimately it is what it is.
Well, right. Like there's so many clever little bits. Like I think the part that I may have laughed the hardest at is the bit where the train is going around these really tight switchback curves. But this is where, he's taken control. They're heading back. He's got the girl with him. He ends up off the train, and he has to try to catch up with it. by cutting across the steep hill and going down this like rocky cliff to try to catch up to where the train's going around. But what he doesn't realize is that while the train's going around the curve, she's trying to help him by stopping the train and setting it to go in reverse. So by just by the time he gets down to where the train is about to reach him and he'll catch up with it again, it starts going back up the other way. Stuff like that. And so there's lots of clever little bits, bits where like he's got these two cars ahead of him that he needs to get out of his way so that he can continue following the other train. But then, so he rigs up this whole complicated thing to get them off onto a sidetrack, but then he starts focusing on something else, doesn't realize that the sidetrack just merges back with the original one again, so they're still back there when he looks up again. So all of these clever little bits, but at the same time, what it all kind of adds up to is a movie that I feel like is more admirable than enjoyable. Which isn't to say it's not enjoyable, but only in the context of how high up on the list it is. I enjoy the other movies that are surrounding it more.
Yep.
Now, that said, this movie as sort of a emblematic representation of Buster Keaton's career and him kind of deserving to be remembered as an icon of early cinema, well, I will give it lots of credit for that, but at the same time, when we talk about it in that context, what we can say is one of the best things about The General is that it attracts attention to Buster Keaton, so maybe people will watch some of his other movies too. Which is not to say they're better than The General, but they're doing different things, right? The General is got all of these technical feats, and it's pretty funny. It's entertaining, but it's so focused on some of the technical stuff, which is remarkable, but easily eclipsed by what they can do with effects these days. And it's remarkable that it wasn't effects at the time, but it's also kind of like no one's ever going to do it that way again because it's dangerous and difficult compared to the way they can do it with effects now. So in some ways, one of the there's a podcast called Unspooled where they're actually also going through this list. And in the episode on this movie, what they talked about was comparing it honestly to the Jackass movies, which, yeah, I mean, I can kind of see that in the sense that they're doing like actual real stunts. You know what I mean? Not that I think it's necessarily smart for them to do it either, but that's kind of the whole point, right? Right. But what I would actually say, though, is that after watching The General, I also turned on Sherlock Jr., which is another Buster Keaton movie that's a little shorter. It's like close to an hour, I think. It's also on Amazon Prime Video. And that one's a lot funnier, does some really cool stuff with him. He's a movie theater projectionist, and him like going up and merging with the movie screen. And it has some early takes on the sort of thing that we sometimes associate with cartoons, where like he's in the movie and the scene keeps changing. But so like he goes to sit on the park bench that's in the scene, but then it changes to a desert, and so he just falls back into the sand, and then he's like staggering up and he's getting the sand out of his eyes, and it cuts to like this rocky cliff, and he almost walks off the cliff because he's wiping the sand out of his eyes, stuff like that. And it's got a lot more of the sort of the classic funny stuff. So I feel like if anyone has never seen any other Buster Keaton stuff and you watch this one, I would recommend you watch one of the other ones too, just so you kind of get the full scope of what he was doing. So I feel like we both, we don't necessarily have a lot more to say about it because we both kind of like there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about, but neither of us have the passion for it. It seems like.
Yeah, I don't need to like go through it scene by scene or anything like that. I liked it. I'm happy. I'm glad I've seen it. But ultimately, I mean, one of the coolest car chases is in Bullet, and we don't put Bullet on the list just because it has an awesome car chase, through San Francisco. Like, you have to have more than that, so.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's this.
It is more than that. I guess that's a little, yeah, sorry. You're right.
No, I think though that I think what it does come down to though is that this movie is in some ways being made to carry more than its own weight. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even just this movie so much as it is, we got to have a Buster Keaton on there, right? Which one should it be? Oh, I don't know, maybe the General? Because as high as it is, it was not on the previous version of the list.
Right.
So I think that might have been more of a reflection of um, people saying, there's not even a single Buster Keaton movie. We've got to have at least one. And so
Right.
then
So
you got to pick one. But he
yeah,
made
yeah,
hundreds of short films, and we're only doing features. So which ones count? I mean, he didn't make that many long features, so I guess the General. But it's kind of being made to stand in for the rest of his career, I think.
right. It's almost like a lifetime achievement
Mm-hmm.
ranking, and also again, like we talked about, this is one of many movies that was kind of like changing how silent films were being told.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I said before, taking them out of like just being filmed theater and actually using this medium.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of buoyed by both of those things, you know.
Right. But boy, for all of that, I just keep thinking of clever little bits, like the whole bit where he ends up hiding under the table of the generals making their strategy discussion, almost gets burned by one of them burning a hole in the tablecloth with his cigar, but then they use that hole to let him see that his girl is there.
Yep.
I mean, that's some clever filmmaking, right? Especially in context of the time. But that's part of the problem, is that almost everything that we can say is great about this is always framed in given the context of the time, as opposed to just as enjoyable today.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the other movies that, as were this high on the list, they can be maybe not quite as old. 1927 is not the oldest movie on the list, but it's close. I think we had, we see, Sunrise was also 1927, the same year. And I think we had one that was maybe even earlier. Like, but we don't have the list sorted that way, so it's not easy to just quickly check. I'm having to like scroll up the list. 1925 was Chaplin's The Gold Rush.
16 Intolerance.
Yeah, there you go. That I was thinking Intolerance was earlier. But like, just compare it to, The Gold Rush, which, okay, sure, if we're talking about just technical spectacle of like how difficult and dangerous the stunts were, it's not as difficult and dangerous as that. But as a movie that I would put on and watch again, I would watch The Gold Rush probably several times before I'd watch General again.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead then and leave the General behind, respecting Buster Keaton as we do, but moving on to number 17, The Graduate, 1967 Dustin Hoffman movie. It's listed as a drama here on this list, although, I guess it's a drama. I mean, it's maybe more a drama than anything else, although it's pretty funny in many spots.
Part of it to me is almost like a dark comedy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But obviously this is a Mike Nichols movie. Was it his first movie? I'm pulling up his filmography. But how about this? I'll look this up. You give just sort of the back of the box cover synopsis of what The Graduate is about for anyone who hasn't seen it.
It's about a guy who's a graduate. No, so Benjamin Braddock graduates from college, comes home, but he doesn't really know what he wants to do with his future. And basically the movie is about him kind of it's not just searching for what he wants to do, but also just searching for meaning. Like he felt like this was like the graduation was such, like the big moment. Lots and lots of movies have sort of touched on this of like once you get to the achievement, what happens after. But this one just does it in such a powerful way that really resonates. I mean, it was right there in the 60s, but it's told in a way that still makes sense today. I mean, that's, I think, what's so powerful about this movie is that, his kind of search for what to do like I said, it resonates. So anyway, I mean, the part that everybody knows about is that one of the things that he does is that in his graduation party, he meets one of his parents' friends, wives, who is also essentially on her own little search for meaning, or is sort of nihilistic, or however you want to really describe Mrs. Robinson. Everybody,
Yeah. Well, we'll
and
talk about her for sure.
yeah, and she seduces him, which he then willingly goes along with it, but it only exacerbates his it's almost like because he's sort of like depressed and doesn't really know what to do, this relationship almost fulfills his own, depression. Like I'm doing this because I'm depressed and don't know what to do, but this proves that I'm depressed and don't know what to do because I'm having an affair with my father's partner's wife, And so it's this weird spiral and just sort of complicated relationship. And then ultimately he's asked to take out the Robinson's daughter when she's back from school to just entertain her. He initially, because Mrs. Robinson doesn't want him to do it, he tries to be an asshole to her and make her not like him. But he's not. What he realizes in that moment is that he's not a bad person, and he feels terrible when he actually when what his plan to do works, and she's actually upset with him.
Yeah,
he feels terrible, and then starts becoming his real self. And what he's finding in that transition is that his relationship with her is allowing him to start to feel again and start to get out of that, negative scenario. But then he is, ultimately Mrs. Robinson doesn't like that. And so she accuses him of having raped her, which then, gets him in trouble and
mm-hmm.
He's not allowed to see Elaine. She hates him. Everybody hates him now. And he has to go and try to pursue her. And ultimately, there's a lot of scenes with this, but she ends up dating somebody else. And the final scene is that he crashes their wedding and they run away together. And they get on a bus. And the final scene of the movie is them just sitting there, almost like the same problem that he ran into at the beginning is now that he's got what he wants, he doesn't really know what to do.
That final shot is kind of just the visual equivalent of happily ever after ... question mark.
Right. But what ties it together so well is that the whole initiation of it is that he went through all the trouble to be this perfect graduate, and then he doesn't know what to do.
Right.
And then he goes through all the trouble to win Elaine back, and then he almost doesn't know what to do. I mean, it's almost and I don't know, it's really powerful, I thought, and there's tons more to this movie, obviously, but that's kind of the plot synopsis that you were asking for.
Yeah, no. So, and just to follow through what I was looking up, Mike Nichols did have one feature film before this one, and it was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which also on this list, also very good. Very different kind of movie, though, right? That one is essentially a slightly upgraded version of a stage play based on a stage play. Whereas this one is adapted from a novel, changed a lot more, and using a lot more cinematic techniques in a much more cinematic respect, as opposed to let's make a movie version of a stage play.
Right.
So it's interesting, actually, to see that those were back to back, especially since one was black and white, and then go to this one in color. So let me preface this by saying that I like this movie a lot. I really enjoyed rewatching it, absolutely. But I'm going to, for the sake of this discussion, take a little bit of a contrarian viewpoint.
Ooh.
And I hope that that won't be taken as meaning more than it does. Because I want to, again, say this is all coming from I really like this movie. I think it deserves to be on the list. But I think that I have some different takes on some of it as I've kind of thought about it and watched it over the years. And
Okay.
so definitely none of this should be taken as like trashing the movie or anything like that because it's not that. But it's more just kind of in the context of like who Benjamin is as a character. For one, we're told lots of things about how great he was as a graduate, but like there's really no point in the movie where we see any of that. Like we kind of it's all and this may even be like it might be deliberate that they're wanting that to kind of feel unreal, like he's coming back and it like this whole everything that his life was preparing for this moment that now has all just sort of disintegrated now that it's happened and doesn't feel actually useful or meaningful for anything, right?
I think about that almost like, not seeing the shark in Jaws. It's like you don't leave it up to your imagination to what he did because it's not important. It doesn't matter what
Well,
he
we do
did.
eventually see the shark in Jaws, though.
Okay, fair enough. I guess maybe that's not the right analogy. I mean, my point is like you're allowing the viewer to imprint their own
Mm-hmm.
take on the situation. Like that's how I see it. Not that it doesn't show us it. It allows us to internalize whatever it is that we feel like he needed to
Mm-hmm.
do to get into that position by just telling us that's what happened.
Right.
And then now we're dealing with the aftermath. That's the important part.
Right.
And so that's how I took it, at least.
Well, no, and again, so the reason I really kind of even bring that element up is not because that in and of itself is so important so much as it's an element of what does Benjamin actually have to offer? Like, we get it with Mrs. Robinson because to some extent it's just sex, but then it's also, it's a way to express her hatred of her life. Which we'll talk more about in a minute because I think she's an amazing character too. But again, it's just like when Benjamin wants to start dating Elaine, like why should she be interested in him?
Yeah, and I think what it kind of leaves it up to is, again, it's because the movie's not about that. It's
Mm,
just it's sort of skipping that part
yeah.
and just saying, "Oh, remember they've known each other for 20 years." And so there was obvious, like I think you're left to like interpret that there was something there, and that this is just, I think it's just like, again, it's not important, and so it
Yeah.
shorthands it, and I'm okay with that. I do get your criticism,
Mm.
um,
Well, so
but
I
I'm fine with them
yeah.
shorthanding that part.
And
Sorry, go
and
ahead.
what I'm kind of getting to ultimately is that the movie shorthands a lot of things so that it can be about this very specific feeling. And it does reflect that very well, a feeling that a lot of people actually deal with, and that's why it resonates. And so that's not critical at all of it really trying to narrow in on that experience and depicting that very effectively. But I am also just thinking to myself as I watch him laze about in his pool, it's like, gee, he sure is lucky that he has well off parents that can afford to just support him for months and let him do whatever he wants and only mildly criticize him. And then he gets to sleep with the hot neighbor for a while. And then he gets the girl anyway, despite all the bullshit that he puts her through. Um, and I know that the movie's not exactly trying to make it seem like this is a perfect happy ending, but it's also kind of like, other than being the stand in for depicting this feeling that a lot of people experience, like, what does he have going for him? Like, that's why I brought up the stuff about, like, who
Yeah,
he
that's fair.
was as a student. It's like we don't ever see the positive qualities that supposedly he's bringing to the table. We don't really ever see him do any of that.
And I mean, I think, and it's definitely on purpose, you know. And I think, again, my take on it has always been because it allows you then to like kind of imprint your own
Mm-hmm.
whatever onto him and your own experiences.
Yeah.
And I also think it's by design, like what you talked about. Like, yeah, the whole point is that he's really fortunate. Like, in outside of like what we're seeing, how he responds to it, being able to like hang out and drink beer in the pool all day and sleep
Mm-hmm.
with a hot neighbor is not a bad life, and then win the girl at the end. But it's the fact that, right, that's why this is so hard, is that he doesn't have that bad of a life, and he's created this whole, and I think that's what resonates for me, is it's like, you're sitting there, you're this whole woe is me thing, but you're really not in a bad position.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're searching for meaning from a pretty high up place, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Right.
And I think that's part of what the movie's trying to say, is like, yeah, his shit is not, you know, his situation is not that bad, but he has created this whole thing out of it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, and I think ultimately that does play into the duality of that theme with, him and Mrs. Robinson, because Mrs. Robinson's whole thing is that she feels like she could have had a, quote, real, more interesting, more fulfilling life, but she essentially traded it for financial security by marrying, rich business guy instead of pursuing her art, or whatever she feels now that would have been more fulfilling. And she resents her daughter because the daughter being, her being pregnant was essentially what made her make that choice. Right? And so having the whole idea of this privileged life actually being sort of a prison, right? Like she represents, like, you know, the darkness that Benjamin's current tunnel leads to if he doesn't change course, right? But at the same time, like, the darkness that Benjamin is currently in feels entirely self-inflicted, right? Like, gosh, what, his awful parents who did nothing but support him financially and be incredibly supportive of all of his activities and be very proud of their son when he achieves good things and care about him enough to try to help him get off his butt when he's struggling. And, so at a certain point, it's kind of like, there are parts of the movie where it's sort of made to feel a little bit like his parents are sort of these, you know, like, you know, like case managers or something like that, where they're hassling him. It's annoying that they want him to stop being in the pool, but at the same time, it's like his parents really, like, they don't listen to him very much. Like, there's that element of it, but he's also not very communicative. You know what? I
no,
take that back. As because I'm just thinking of the scene where his dad gets him the scuba gear, and he is actually there saying, "I'm not comfortable with this. I don't want to do this. Don't make me come out there," and all of that. So he's saying that, but he's not standing up for himself.
no, and that's where Dustin Hoffman is very good in this
Mm-hmm.
role, because he has a way of delivering that where it's like he's saying it, but he's not like pushing for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, that's one of the, I feel like one of the more powerful scenes in the movie to talk about exactly what we're discussing here. And part of the reason, like, again, I think this movie is so good is because all the things you're saying are true.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes this like more nuanced and complicated, and why it resonates with me is like there's an incredible obvious symbolism there of like him becoming the diver in his own fish tank, and
Mm-hmm.
so he's feeling like he's just there to be observed, and he's like alone and insulated from everybody. Like there's this whole metaphor to him being in the scuba gear, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like he didn't really push for himself to not get in the scuba gear.
Right.
He was getting into his parents' backyard pool with expensive scuba gear that they purchased for him. Like, he's not really in that bad of a situation, and it makes it feel like this is like the worst thing that ever happened to him, that he has to sit at the bottom of the pool and be observed. You know?
Mm-hmm.
And I just really like that part of this movie, you know. So, but
Well,
I do respect the critical, you know, acknowledgement. Yeah.
Part like this, and again, like this is deliberate. I'm sure, but and because it's part of the theme, but like it is this dilemma where he sort of resents being told what to do all the time, and he just wants time to think or whatever. Like he sort of wants to be treated like an adult, but he's acting like a child.
Right.
Right? Like he lets Mrs. Robinson essentially bully him into having an affair over a period of months. Which again, you know, it's like bully him. I mean, you know, like we can see.
But yeah, to your point about him being communicative, like when she first like approaches him, he's just like, "No, I don't want to do that." But he doesn't really assert himself. He just says the words, and then ultimately she doesn't make him do it then.
Yeah.
Because she plays him correctly and says like, "Oh, well, just so you know, I'm available when you're ready." You know?
I mean, he basically flees the scene like a scared rabbit.
Yeah.
Because she's being very aggressive. You know, like literally, I've gone into the bedroom and taken all my clothes off, but I'm calling down to you as you try to leave. Can you bring up my purse? I don't want to go back down the stairs. And there's this whole thing of like, I'm going to come up the stairs and set the purse on the landing. And she's like, don't be a child. Bring it all the way in. Do I have to bring it all the way in? Okay, I mean, I guess I'll just like open the door a crack and just like set it on the dresser. And then she's just like, this idiot child won't just follow instructions, and yet he acts as though he is just this whipped dog. You know what I mean? Like instead of just saying, "All right, nope, sorry, I'm leaving." You know, but it's like the whole bit where the famous line, right? You're trying to seduce me, and then she gives him the slightest little bit of like, what? What are you talking about? And he's like, oh my God, I did everything wrong. I can't believe I misinterpreted that. I'm so sorry. And he's like, I mean, I get it. Like, I think that there's a lot of fun and, like the performance is great. It's there's a lot of comedy coming from how awkward he is and everything. But again, like what it all adds up to, fun scenes to watch for sure. But it's also just kind of, when we kind of put it all together, I'm trying to say like, after all of that whole sequence, he does call her, right? He does ask her, yes, I do want to proceed, right? And to some extent, it's interesting because it's the first time we see him make a choice that he doesn't have to make and is specifically not the one his parents would want him to make. But it's also kind of framed as just wallowing even deeper in this malaise he's already got himself in.
Right. That's what I was kind of saying in the summary is like, I feel like that whole piece is he's essentially built this self-fulfilling thing of like, well, I'm depressed and nothing's going right for me. So I'm going to choose to do something that's not right. So I can say that I'm doing this. Like the whole thing just kind of weaves together, you know. So
yeah, that speaking of weaving together, like this section has a really cool montage where they use a lot of really clever cuts and edits to create this state where it feels very kind of dreamlike and disorienting, where we'll see him get out of the pool and start to walk into the house, but then when we're seeing him inside, he's actually not in the house. He's over at the hotel room with Mrs. Robinson, and he's sort of trying to get dressed while she's in the background. And then we see that he goes to sit in a chair, but now he's back in his own bedroom. And, so it's just cutting between all these different places, making it feel like this is a montage. We get the sense time is passing and all of these days are kind of blending together for him. And it's just shown
so
with
good.
all of these cuts in a very kind of cool way.
Yeah, it's a really, really good cinematic tool. So.
Right.
And the use of music, you know,
Hmm.
which I'm sure we were going to get to at some point.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that really did strike me putting it on is I think it's been a really long time since I've heard Simon and Garfunkel on like a good stereo and not just like through headphones or over here heard on the PA system at the grocery store or something. You know what I mean? Like good speakers with bass and everything like that. And so it's like, oh yeah. I mean, not that I ever felt like I didn't like the songs, but I just sort of they stood out to me more than I expected.
Oh,
And it does kind of tie in. I think we mentioned this in the last episode, but this was 1967, which comparing to Easy Rider, which was in 1969. But one of the things that we said about Easy Rider at the time when we talked about the podcast is one of the first movies to ever use, pop songs or like popular music as its soundtrack. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, I guess other movies had already done it. Graduate did it 2 years earlier. Although it's a little different because one of the songs was written for the movie, more or less. I mean, here's to you, Mrs. Robinson, right? It's the character's name. Um, but all the songs are like the same artist, right? So instead of just being kind of like a jukebox, it's
yeah, it comes across almost like an album, you know.
right. Yeah, exactly. So it's a little different, but yeah, the the music is very much of a piece with it, right? Like, um, I mean, there's a reason that on Arrested Development, it became kind of the, hello darkness, my old friend. Like there are memes and stuff, like with this whole bit, right? This this feeling of, well, if you have existential angst, then you hear the Simon and Garfunkel spin up on the soundtrack because that's yeah. So the music is really striking. Like it's good music. It's a funny little bit of trivia that if you look up Roger Ebert's original 1967 review of it, because that is how he was reviewing movies at that time, he gave it 4 stars. He really liked it. And then reviewed the 30th anniversary in 1997 and gave it 3 stars. But one of the things he notes in the 30th anniversary review is his amusement that in the original review he called the music forgettable. And so he said in the 1997 version, obviously time has shown that I was mistaken. But yeah, the music's really good and so impossible to separate from this movie in my mind.
Yep.
Um, Although at the same time, the only thing that's a little bit weird about it is, despite the Mrs. Robinson song like literally having the character's name in it, the actual lyrics of that song don't really make a super lot of sense with what's happening in the story exactly. Because it's like, here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will know. At the time that he's planning to openly defy her by stealing her daughter away from the wedding, like that's not really the like the music's good. We like it, but it's more of the feel of the music than the meaning of the lyrics.
Yeah, but I feel like that's part of like the same thing we were talking about earlier with like the intended sort of duality to everything that's in this movie. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's you know yes, if you just take at face value what they're showing us as happening, he has all this angst, but the reality is his situation's not that bad, and so
Mm-hmm.
the same thing. Like, the music is telling a story that isn't really the story, So
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, let's we also let's talk a little bit about Elaine. Um, Elaine is the daughter, right? And so there is that sort of first date where he takes her to a strip club, and it actually reminded me a lot of Taxi Driver, honestly. And then honestly, Joker, because Joker pulls the same move. You know what I mean? Like, no, I'm combining something else. But the point being, the idea of taking the nice girl to a trashy place, right? And it's true that um, he's doing it because he's trying to like make her not like him. But at the same time, I don't really feel like the fact that she gets so upset that he starts to cry and then he feels bad. I feel like a person with full emotional understanding of other people as individuals with their own thoughts and feelings could have probably foreseen that outcome and not chosen to do that.
Yeah, but I think it's just showing how self-centered he is that he's not being empathetic until that happens, and it like reawakens him into being a human being again. Like that's how I took that.
I guess, but I just feel like to do that requires a conscious forethought of what he expects her reaction to be and choosing that and then only realizing after the fact that he doesn't like it.
Right, and so the way I took it though is that he had no forethought as to what her reaction would be. He wasn't
No,
even considering her as part of the equation.
no. That can't possibly be because why would he do that if not to make her upset?
Because he felt like that's what he needed to do.
He needed to make her upset, so he
Right,
chose
but
a date based on making her upset.
he didn't have the bandwidth to understand, to have an empathy as to what that actually looked like.
Okay, well, that doesn't help the case. That's you're kind of making my point, which is that he is treating another human being as I can make her upset and furious and sad because it suits my purposes.
Right, but I think you're ascribing more detail to how he was interpreting it than I felt like.
He
I felt like he
chose
just
to take her to a place that he didn't usually go, a strip club.
right. But I'm saying like I'm thinking like almost in the terms of like he's thinking of her more as like this abstract like thing that he needs to do, not as like what it would actually mean for her to be upset. I
See,
think we're I think we see it I think we're seeing the exact same thing, but we're interpreting it two different ways, which is fine. But
yeah.
yeah,
I'm saying it's not thoughtless, it's malicious.
and
And then
I'm
he
saying
feels
it's
bad.
yeah. I think it was more like it was disconnected from almost more like a like sociopathic in the way that he's like disconnected from
I,
what could actually happen.
I
We can
disagree.
disagree. I mean, you're not going to convince me, so
Well,
and I'm not going to
okay,
convince you.
but I'm
Yeah.
just saying sociopathic implying that he does not like process or understand what her reaction would be. He chose a venue designed to provoke that response.
Right, and I'm saying I agree. I feel like the point was though that he's so disconnected from other people at that point that he didn't even factor in what that response actually would look like, as
And my
opposed to
point
it being
is
a
that is
theoretical
super
thing,
shitty and not okay. And frankly, he doesn't really redeem himself, in my opinion.
which is fair. I think he does because I think what happens is that when he sees that real response, it's almost like he reboots back into being a human, and being an empathetic person.
And continues to date her because it makes him feel good, despite knowing that he had been sleeping with her mother for months and not telling her until Mrs. Robinson forces the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I feel like he never at any point in the movie stops being selfish about it. I don't think he really ever is considering the feelings of the other person in that scenario.
I guess it's a fair argument to make.
I mean, he certainly stalks her when she doesn't want to see him or talk to him. Um, he breaks into her wedding without having talked to her to see if she had any, like, the fact that she decided to go with him is frankly probably just chalk that up to poor judgment on her part. I mean, but he certainly didn't like see if it was okay before he disrupted her wedding. Now, again, like, I'm not saying this makes him like that he makes him a person that we can't sympathize with, but he is fundamentally acting selfishly throughout. You know, like the fact that he has found Elaine makes him feel better in a way that he didn't feel before, that Mrs. Robinson didn't make him feel. And he wants that because it feels like waking up out of this haze. Like, okay, yeah, like we can understand that and follow that along. But he is really kind of using Elaine for that feeling as opposed to thinking about what's actually good for her. With the one exception of he does not let Mrs. Robinson be the one to tell her. He chooses to make the right decision. I feel like that's the one real selfless thing he does in the movie, is that when Mrs. Robinson finally forces the issue, which it takes her getting into his car soaking wet in the middle of the rain, and basically telling him, you know, you're going to end it right now or I'll tell her everything, which is kind of a mutually assured destruction sort of scenario. But him deciding, rather than let that be that ultimatum stand or be manipulated in that way, that's where he finally makes the adult decision to say, I have been being selfish by not being honest, and now I will be, even though I know it will hurt her, it will hurt me, it will blow up everything I've been trying to do. It's going to be a big mess, but I have to do it because I have to be honest. And so that is a big, like, grown-up moment for him.
Right.
But then he follows that up by stalking her at school and crashing her wedding.
Yeah, I mean, I'm never going to make the argument that he's a good person. Like that's sort of part of. I think that's kind of part of the movie is that you know he doesn't do a lot of the right things. Like yeah, I'm not gonna. I can't argue with that.
Well,
right?
and again, like and let me just reiterate what I'm saying about, like, I enjoy watching this movie, and I think that there is a lot to sympathize as we follow along with Benjamin as a character, and we understand why he's making the decisions he makes, even if we don't approve of them. And we get it, right? Like, he is depicting something, and I think it's fair to be critical of it while also understanding why it resonates, and that he is nonetheless a sympathetic character, even as he is making a lot of what I think are really bad decisions. And I think that the movie agrees that those are bad decisions. I don't think when he is stalking her at school, the movie is trying to have us be on his side. You know what I mean? Like, it's intended for us to understand that he is sinking in this, right? Like, he thought he had escaped his malaise because she helped him sort of wake up from that daze. But now he has just become obsessed with thinking like that she's the only person that can do that for him. There's a whole conversation with his parents where he's like, we're getting married. And they're like, oh, that's wonderful. So we can call her parents? And he's like, no, they don't know yet. It's like, well, when did you talk to Elaine? I felt like we talked. It's like, oh, no, she doesn't know yet either. And that's when his parents are really kind of like, okay, wait a minute, Benjamin. What are you doing here? This is not how this works. And they are the voice of reason in that moment, right? Is that, they're trying to explain to him that, what are you talking about? This is not how to do this. And then there's a whole, like, weird sequence where she does, honestly, one of the only things that is really kind of showing initiative for her character, which is that she becomes aware that he's been following her around, and she comes to his little place to confront him. And I don't really like the plot point that apparently the mom's explanation was that, oh, he tried to rape me, like, and the problem I have with that is that, like, it leaves too vague what Elaine thinks about that, because it's one thing if we're meant to understand completely that Elaine understands intuitively that Mrs. Robinson is making that up and that it's not true. But I feel like if she ever did believe it, she lets go of it awfully quickly. And it's left a little bit vague what she actually believes about that, and they don't ever really resolve it. And then she's so upset that she's screaming enough that all the neighbors come in, and like we have Richard Dreyfuss show up to say, should we call the cops, which is kind of funny. Just Richard Dreyfuss in this tiny little bit part walk-on role, one line extra. But then she's fine, and she's going off and getting married, but like I just feel like that I don't understand her emotional arc in that scene. It kind of doesn't feel like she's a real character. It feels like she's doing what the plot needs her to do.
It's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So now that I think I have. Okay, one last one. I think that while this movie does sort of capture a mood that I think resonates for a lot of people, and I think, though, that looking at it now and understanding that it's telling the experience of sort of a fairly narrow subset of people, like it doesn't, if it wants to be about how he actually is pretty privileged and understanding that how his malaise kind of comes from that to some extent, it doesn't really ever show him grapple with any other aspect of it. Like they kind of touches on it a little bit with him getting that crappy room, but it never really becomes a problem in any way. He doesn't really ever talk to anyone who's not, from his social economic group. He ends up running off with the girl that his parents wanted him to date in the first place. So like what ultimately, it's fine for a movie to just be about depicting an experience, but if the movie is actually trying to make some kind of point, what is it, do you think?
I mean, I think that's what I've always found so fascinating about this movie is that I don't feel like it is. Like I feel like it's just giving you the feeling from of a self-centered person from his self-centered perspective, mm-hmm. and making you feel what he's feeling, and almost, I don't know, for me, I don't want to say I agree with him, but I don't know, it leaves me with this really complicated place, and I don't know. This movie is all. I mean, obviously, it has some phenomenal cinematic tricks to it. But what I leave this movie with is the way I feel when I watch it, mm-hmm. and it's very I don't know. I was trying to think about it the other day because I watched it twice since we said we were supposed to watch it, mm-hmm. For this conversation, and I almost for me, did this movie do what? I think you brought up Joker earlier, what some people feel with that, where even though they don't agree with what the Joker did, it almost feels like that's the extreme version of them feeling heard.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I almost regret even bringing up Joker just because I think that's more extreme of a comparison than I really intended to make.
Yeah, but the idea of taking that extreme scenario on screen and saying oh, this exhibits some of the things that I'm feeling and or I have felt in my life and kind of ascribes it to it. I don't necessarily think that that's not true. I think there are definitely times when I've felt like I didn't know what was next or what was the meaning of things, and but I recognize I'm coming from a point of privilege because of it's a malaise that's not an extreme it's not a poverty or oppression or anything like that. You're in this position, but yet you still have those same feelings, and it almost feels like it gives a voice to that. And so I sometimes feel like maybe it purposely skates on some of those plot points to allow for it to be more of this like almost like that montage where it's almost like dreamlike and like how it actually comes together of like what it's trying to tell you. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to explain. This movie just leaves me with a feeling more than like, oh, this is to your point. Like everything you brought up there in your contrarian thing is all accurate.
Yeah.
Like these are all things that happened or didn't happen or weren't done correctly. But I don't care when I finish watching this movie. Like this movie makes me feel a certain way that is going to make me leave it really really high on this list because it just delivers, you know. So
Yeah. So I now that I've kind of gotten my various contrarian points out, I'll return to saying that this movie does have a feeling to it. Like I when I was rewatching it, I was recognizing that like despite knowing so many pieces of it practically by heart, it had been a while since I really just sat down and watched them all start to finish. And it really does have this excellent carrying along of, uh, just being there with Benjamin and experiencing the awkwardness with him when he's standing around in the hotel lobby trying to arrange to get a room, but he doesn't know what he's doing, and then just putting us in his headspace as he goes through all of these things and just the journey that we take with him as depicted by the various cinematic techniques and the music and Dustin Hoffman's performance, and then the performances from the other actors, Anne Bancroft and Catherine Ross. Am I right about Elaine?
mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
I was thinking Karen Ross, but no. But the everyone like this movie, despite my being able to find fault with a lot of individual parts, I think what this movie really does accomplish is becoming this gestalt of like you can maybe point to all of these individual beats and say, well, I don't know if I like this. I think I have a problem with that, or I'm not sure about this. But at the same time, you put it all together into one piece of art, and it really just creates a kind of magic that movies can really only do at the highest levels. You know, so, I'm reiterating what I said at the beginning, which was I do really like this movie. I do think it's very good. I do think it belongs high on the list. I does not mean that I don't have some problems with it, but boy, it sure does do what it does very well.
Yep.
And some of my quibbles are maybe wishing it would do something else in some spots, but what it chooses to do, it does very well.
Perfect. So
Yeah. All right.
we're
So,
coming up on an hour and a half since we started, so
mm-hmm.
we could. I'm ready to kind of wrap it
Yeah,
up and
sure.
make our selections.
Yeah. Do you know where you're wanting to put stuff?
I'm leaving The Graduate, so that one's easy.
All right.
Um, I think there's going to be more and more of that as we get
Yeah.
here. And I don't know. I was looking at this, but uh, I mean, I, I feel like I'm okay with leaving it on the list, but I feel like I kind of just want to put it at like 100, like
Oh, the
just like
general.
yeah, the general, just like
Mm-hmm.
give it the list, but don't put it any higher than what I actually like feel about it.
Yeah. I
So
yeah, I get that. I'm moving it pretty low myself. Um, so for you, the graduate is going to stay where it is at number 17, and the general moves to 100. For me, let's see. Where do I want to put the graduate? I think. Sure, I'll put it there because it makes me smile and it's about where I was thinking anyway. I'm going to put it in the mid 40s between Midnight Cowboy and Taxi Driver, which I'm just laughing at because, of course, Midnight Cowboy was Dustin Hoffman's next role that he won an Oscar for, and then Taxi Driver we came up in the discussion this time. So
It is funny.
yeah. All right, so that's gonna put. I think Graduate becomes like 43. Yeah, The Graduate becomes 43, and General. Oh, I guess I ended up with it at 100 because we actually have our two write-ins that make it 102. So I ended up with it at 100. Whereas if you put it all the way at the bottom, that makes it 102.
Oh no, I meant to put it at 100.
Okay,
Sorry.
well, we have different movies as the ones below it, but then it ends up at 100 for both.
Yep.
All right. So, continuing on through the list, we have now reached the next two movies are going to be number 16, Sunset Boulevard, which is, I'm excited just because, I mean, it's a little bit noirish, but I also just, the whole beginning and framing device has been ripped off so many times, and I love it every single time. The voiceover of, I mean, it's kind of the melodramatic version of, yep, this is me. I bet you're wondering how I ended up in this situation.
Yep.
But we'll be talking about that. So 1950 drama. And then, of course, number 15, 2001, A Space Odyssey.
So good.
Yeah. All right. So we'll leave it there for now. And so we'll be back for more. And in the meantime, watch good movies.
Yep.